The Wrestler is a 2008 movie starring Mickey Rourke. Nominated for Best Actor. I think he won and won for Best Actor that year in 2009. It tells a fictional tale of a man named Randy the Ram Robinson who has devoted his entire life to pro wrestling, to touring pro wrestling shows all around the circuit, and he basically gives his whole life to this. And as he begins to age and he gets out of sort of the early successful days of his early career and into his middle and later career, his life sort of begins to revolve into this sort of smaller and smaller circle around these shows and the grueling lifestyle, and he plays the smaller and smaller markets. And when the movie begins, you open up on his life when he's really in the twilight of his career. And frankly, his life is a total mess. His life has been marked by incredible instability. His living conditions are very mean. He's very poor. These shows do not pay well. It goes with the lifestyle generally of drugs and alcoholism. He has no stable relationship in his life, and his one most meaningful relationship with his daughter is estranged. And you sort of open up onto the wreckage of this life. And his life has been wrecked by the same sorts of things that can cause any life to be wrecked. Bad decisions stacked on each other over time, mixed with adverse circumstances, mixed with just some things that haven't gone his way that are completely out of his control. And as the movie goes on, you actually watch him begin to come to a realization of some of these things and begins to make some different decisions. And he realizes that his wrestling days are fast becoming his past and not his future, and he begins to move in a different direction. He meets somebody that he has a real, wonderful, warm relationship with. He cares for her, and she really cares for him as he is, and that begins to be healing for him. And he reaches out and he reconnects to his estranged daughter. She's defensive at first, but he's really apologetic, and they begin to rebuild some things. And he begins to make decisions where you're like, this guy's growing up. He's beginning to leave behind some of these bad habits and these bad patterns. And then, of course, about nearing the last movement of the movie, some of the things from his life begin to reach back out and pull him back in some of these bad decisions that he's been making. And you just watch with this almost sort of Shakespearean level of tragedy as his old life reaches back in and makes him make all the same decisions over and over again. And right near the end of the movie, he has a monologue. He's about to perform in another show. It's probably for various reasons about to be his last show. And he stands up in front of everyone in the ring, and he gives a monologue that is referring to why he chose to be here back in the ring in the first place. But it's really a monologue that explains why he's lived his life the way that he has, and why he's made the same decisions over and over again. This is what he says. He says, you know, if you live hard and you play hard, you burn the candle at both ends, you pay the price for it. In this life, you can lose everything you love and everything that loves you. He goes on the stage, speaking directly to the crowd now. You know what? The only ones who are going to tell me when I'm through doing my thing is you people here. You people here. You people here are the ones who are worth bringing it for because you're my family. You see, in Randy's life, Randy the Ram, he's not making the same decisions over and over again just because it's a matter of habit, or just because there are weaknesses chronically that he can't overcome. He's making the same decisions over and over again, because he's searching for something. In Randy's case, he's searching for belonging, he's searching for family, and this place, the feel of the crowd, is the only place that he seems to be able to find what he's looking for. And this is really a very similar dynamic that happens in our own lives, because we all know in our own lives that we have mistakes that we make over and over again. In some ways, God help us, and this would be true if we did not have the framework of the grace of the gospel. The story of our lives would be the story of the same mistakes that we made over and over again. That would be the story of our lives if there was no gracious word that was going to be spoken of us. But we don't just make those mistakes because we're weak in this area or we have bad habits in this area. We make those same mistakes because we're also searching for something. And it might be slightly different for each of us. Maybe it's belonging, maybe it's recognition, maybe it's love. But we're all searching for something, and then we make mistakes on the way in that search, and those mistakes become repeated. And we learn them and repeat them over and over and over again. Why do we keep making the same mistakes over and over again in our lives? And is there any hope for us to stop? Or maybe, if not to stop outright, to make some new mistakes? Is there any hope for those things? These are the questions that we're going to be asking today. We're going through the book of Galatians in this sermon series. We've just been walking exegetically through the text of Galatians. Today we're going to be in Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 to 18:20. We've got all the sermons up online. You can download the audio files from our website if you want to go back and listen to other sermons. There's a lot of contextual information about Galatia and all that sort of stuff. All you need to know for today, in order to jump into the text, is that the letter to the Galatians is an epistle written by the Apostle Paul to first century Christians who are living in the Roman province of Galatia, that's modern-day Turkey. And these people, these early Christians, have come under the influence of a teaching that tells them that they need to get a bunch of things right in their life in order to live a good life with God and other people. And they need to get them right over and over again, particularly in the form of religious or certain cultural observances. But Paul is writing to this because he thinks that the core of this teaching, the idea that you need to get certain things right over and over again in order to be right with God and other people, is so antithetical to the gospel that it needs to be stridently warred against. The Galatians are no longer under the influence of this teaching. We're a little over halfway through the book now. Again, we're going to be in Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 to 20. I'm not going to have the text up on the screen, but I encourage you to open up a Bible or pull the text up on a device so you can follow along as we go. This is what the text says. Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 to 20. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid I might have labored over you in vain. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of the bodily ailments that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of the blessing you felt? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They made much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you might make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you, my little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. We make the same mistakes in our lives over and over again. We make the same mistakes in our lives over and over again. Now, it's not really the making of mistakes that is all that surprising or painful. Everybody makes mistakes, sure. We get things wrong, trial and error, all that sort of stuff. The problem is this whole again and again. That's what hurts about making mistakes in our lives. Now, when we do make mistakes, of course, we're leaving behind certain things that are good as we make them. Errors in our lives take us away from good things. And this is something that Paul is pointing out to the Galatians right at the beginning of the passage. He's telling them, you had all sorts of good things that came to you when you received the gospel. Why have you let all of them go to repeat this error? There are all sorts of things that Paul says they've gotten. First of all, he's implying that they got a new thing, right? He says, formerly, when you did not know God. Right? He's like, formerly you had something over here, but now you have something over here that was new and different, and you've given that up. You've lost that because this error that you're repeating. It's not just a new thing that they've given up, it's freedom. Paul says, formerly you were enslaved, and then he says again, why do you want to turn back and be enslaved again? It's like, this new thing gave you freedom. Why are you giving that up? And finally, and maybe most importantly, he says, this new thing enables you to be known. Not just to know, but this incredibly powerful passage here in verse 9. Not that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God. Paul says, in this new thing, you walked into a relationship with God, and he called you by name. You were known. He says, why are you giving all that up? Now look, when we make mistakes in our lives, of course, they come at the cost of good things that happen. But again, the problem is not that we make mistakes once or twice, it's that they're chronic. Is that they happen over and over and over again. This pain around the word again is reflected in Paul's text in Galatians here. It used to be sort of hides this. It just says in verse 9, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles? And that's really the force of what Paul's saying here. Because literally there are two words in the Greek for again, just put right next to each other in verse 9. Literally it's how can you turn back again and again? It's doubled up. The translation that I looked at that comes the closest to this is the NASB, Bible often used in translation used in Catholic churches that is a little more wooden rendering. This is what the NASB says in Galatians chapter 4, verse 9. It says, "But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again?" That's what they've rendered it, all over again. That's the pain in the mistakes that we make in our lives. It's not the word mistake, it's the word again that hurts. I made this mistake all over again. Again and again and again and again. Right? And again there doesn't just communicate the idea that it's repeated, it communicates the pain and exasperation of it happening another time. Again. Can you think of a mistake in your life where it's not a mistake, it's the again that really is painful about it? That really is shame-inducing? That's like, why can't I break again? Maybe for you it's not exasperation, maybe it's despondency. That happened in my life again. God help me, that happened in my life again. And this word again characterizes the real pain that underlies our mistakes. Not the one-off nature of them, but the fact that they're chronic and repeated, and we keep going over and over and over again. Paul asks this question. He says, how? How can you do this? Verse 9, or rather to be known by God. How can you turn back again? And I don't think there's just exasperation here for Paul. He's not just saying, how can you do this? He's literally asking, what is the mechanism by which you make the same mistake over and over again and leave good things? That's a worthwhile question to ask in our own lives, isn't it? How is it that we keep making these same mistakes over and over and over again? Because if we could actually solve that question, maybe God help us, we would stop. Maybe God help us, we would choose a new mistake to make next time. How is it, Paul says, not just exasperation, but what is the mechanism by which we make the same mistakes and leave good things time and time and time again? And Paul, even though he's asking the question here, is asking in a slightly rhetorical way. Because Paul has an idea of what is causing the Galatians to make this mistake over and over again. Paul thinks that when we feel like we are missing out on something, that is a strong enough feeling and pain and motivator to make us make the same mistakes over and over again. When we feel like there's an inner circle of something in life that we're not part of, or we haven't arrived at yet, or we haven't achieved, the pain and desperation around that is strong enough to make us forsake other things that we know are good and repeat our same rote patterns of mistakes over and over and over again. We make the same mistakes again and again because we think that we are missing out on something. That's what Paul says to the Galatians. Galatians chapter 4, verse 17 says this, "They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you might make much of them." Who's the they here? It's random to just pull the third person personal pronoun out of nowhere, right? They. Who are they? Now, for those of you who have been through the Galatians series, you probably are thinking a little bit about, oh yeah, how did the Galatians come to be under the influence of this teaching in the first place, right? That they did a bunch of things right. Well, they came under the influence of that teaching by people who came to them and preached this message to them. That's the they that Paul is talking about. The people, whoever they are they delegates for Jerusalem? Maybe are they just traveling preachers in the ancient world? In the ancient world, there were sort of traveling philosophers and political representatives and religious leaders who would travel around and peddle various philosophies. Maybe that's who Paul's talking about. Maybe it's these super apostles who show up in Paul's other letters. Paul calls some people in his other letters super apostles. They come around and give all these teachings that are primarily about how good you need to be in order to get right with God. And they're super because they look the part. They look like they're getting everything right. They're on the inside. They're doing a wonderful job. They're super apostles. Paul hates these super apostles. He thinks that their message and their life are not in step with the truth of the gospel. He thinks that their message and their life are in step with something totally different in the gospel. This is what Paul says about the super apostles in 2 Corinthians chapter 13. He says, "I do not fool you, force me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you. For I was not all inferior to these super apostles, even though I'm nothing." He's engaging with the church in Corinth in a similar battle, a similar discussion says these people are playing a really sinister game with the people who they're teaching. He says, they make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that you might make much of them. Paul says these super apostles, these teachers, are inviting you into a particular cycle where they begin by making you feel like, I've got something. I'm getting a couple things right. I've got a reason to believe in myself. I've got all these things that make me feel like I should be really good about myself. He's like, they make much of you, and Paul says, they're not doing that for good purpose. They're not doing that so that it ends in your edification. They're doing it so that it will end in their edification. As you listen to what they're saying and feel like you're getting a couple things right, they're going to swoop in and go, I'm getting everything right. And then you're going to look at them and go, you are. You are getting it all right. You are on the inside. I'm over here. I've been drawn in a little bit by your invitation, but I'm not on the inside yet because I've never gotten where you are. That's what Paul says. What they actually want to do is shut you out so that you might make much of them. It's a cyclical dynamic that happens over and over again where these super apostles are coming to Galatians and other communities and they're saying, here's a couple of things that you're good at, but you're not quite as good to me. Why don't you keep trying to get all the way in? This is the way the world works. This cycle is played out over and over and over again in the world, isn't it? Where relationships, career opportunities, societies, cultures, political systems do just enough to invite you in and make you feel like, oh, I kind of maybe belong here. But then they do just enough to make you feel like, actually, you don't quite get it. I'm sorry, no, you're kind of close, but you've got a couple more steps to go. You've got a couple more things to learn. And you actually just never get it, do you? You never get it right enough. You never get enough things right in the right order. You just are never on the inside. The world is full, it's governed by these insider and outsider dynamics. Where people on the inside, in order to feel good about being on the inside, need there to be multitudes of faceless people who are clamoring to be on the inside, but will never get there. Isn't that how the world works? Paul says this teaching puts you in that cycle and it sticks you there. And once you're there, once you feel like I want so badly to be on the inside, but I'm never going to get there, that is a strong enough feeling to make you over and over again reach for the only thing you know how to get on the inside. And that's repeated patterns of behavior that you just go back to when you're desperate. That's why Paul says you would do something like this over and over and over again. And the world is set up to put you in cycles, in relationships, in social situations, in career situations, in your own sense of yourself. I've never arrived at me. Over and over again, to put you in a place where you feel like, I want to be in so badly, but I just haven't gotten to it. And so I reach for the only thing I know over and over again. And it's that same stuff that makes us repeat the same mistake time and time and time again. We take this and we write this onto our relationship with God, don't we? In reality, we imagine our relationship with God and God's view towards us generally as like a fenced-off complex. Right? There's like a chain link fence on the outside, and like barbed wire on the top. And we're like, God's on the inside. And I want to be in there because like I heard that God's good for me, and like I know that God's good for me somehow. And like I just got to get in there. How can I get inside? I've got to cut a hole in this fence. I've got to climb over it. God's in here, and I just have to get things right enough over time and make as least mistakes as possible, and then I'll be able to get in. And once I'm in, I have to keep making as few mistakes as possible in order to stay in. We think that God is like that because that's how the world tells us things are. That's how this world runs. Never wanting you either to be fully on the inside or fully on the inside, but on that middle place of tension where you just have that gnawing sense that if I can just climb over this fence in the right way this time, I'll finally be in. But that is not how the world of God works. God's world does not work first place? What was it that occasioned your first invitation to wake up to the fact that you're already in with God? First of all, Paul says, it wasn't moralism. He says, you did me no wrong. Right? He doesn't come to the Galatians and say, I preached the gospel to you because I showed up among you and realized how bad you were, and so I preached the gospel to you. He says, that's not what happened. He says, I preached the gospel to you because I was weak. He says, I had a bodily ailment. My weakness was the occasion that led me to tell you, good news, you're already in with God. And Paul's not just being a good guy or a selfish person when he does that. Paul does that because that's how the gospel works. The gospel always comes to us through weakness. Its foundation is weakness. Jesus lived a weak life. He was born into weakness. He was raised into weakness. In his adult life, he wandered around in weakness. His body was weak and frail. He got tired. He had no home. His friends left him. And he died in weakness. He died in weakness on the cross. But the gospel is the place where weakness becomes the foundation for our acceptance. Paul preached the gospel out of his weakness because Jesus invites you to the gospel out of his weakness. We get that wrong all the time. So often we think about the gospel in our lives and we think, it's basically about being good, and then we can be like gracious towards other people who aren't good. But like Jesus was full of strength and goodness, and that was the basis upon which he invited us into fellowship with God. But that misses what Jesus actually did. He became weak because in Jesus, weakness has become the foundation for salvation. Not getting it right and then being nice to people as a result. It's weakness. My being weak is my way with God. If it was true for Jesus, it's true for you. Corinthians 13, verse 4 says this about Jesus. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. Amen. God's work doesn't stop at our weakness, but it only begins when we arrive at what we actually are, which is weak. And that's where God's power shows up. That's where God's power showed up for Jesus. That in his weakness, God raised him up to new life. What if all you needed to be on the inside, was your weaknesses? What if the things that you don't do particularly well, or you get wrong in chronic fashion, was actually the thing that you already had? That was the sign that you were in the family of God. That's true. It was true for Jesus, and it's true for us. And if all we need then is to become weak, and that becoming weak can break us from this cycle of trying again to get on the inside, then we might ask, how do we become weak? And this is the really slippery spot, where we find every new way on the floor down to humility to work our way back up into our own sense of, I got this thing right. What do we do when we become weak? It's so tempting here, right, to give in all sorts of religious impulses. Maybe I need to beat myself up. If I beat myself up enough, then I'll be weak. I need to give myself weaknesses in the flesh. Maybe fasting, spiritual disciplines, not to express relationship with God, but to make myself be weak enough so that God will accept me or something. Right? There are all sorts of impulses to try to make ourselves weak. All sorts of things that we can do. Maybe we just need to feel bad enough about ourselves. If I really beat myself up emotionally, then I'll be weak enough and I'll be in. Paul says, here's the great thing. You don't need to do anything to become weak enough. You just are. You are. says, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? The gospel comes to us when we just start telling the truth about the weaknesses that we have. It's really that simple, and it's that difficult at the same time. Telling the truth and honesty about our weaknesses is the place that we begin to learn in freedom that we're accepted by God exactly as we are, and at the same time, that God's power begins to rush into that place of humble, confessional honestness and begins to do new things in our life that we don't have the power to do on our own. It's so simple. We tell the truth. And it's also really, really hard. We rebel against telling the truth about ourselves. Just like the Galatians in relationship to Paul, voices that encourage us to tell the truth about ourselves. Even voices internally that might say, you have this narrative about what's going on in your life over here, but you actually know deep down that there's a truer story. We treat those external convictions like enemies in our lives. I don't want to be in a relationship with you. I don't want to hear from you. I don't want to talk to you. And so Christ is unable to be formed in us. That's why Paul says in verse 19, he says, I'm in anguish with you, the anguish of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you. Paul thought that Christ had been formed in the Galatians when they first received it. And Paul even says to them, he's like, you were so close because you were willing to gouge your eyes out to help me. It's sort of a mystery in scholarship what Paul's physical ailment was. He never really says, but he was all the weaknesses that I have, all the things that you look at them and I know you're nice to me about them, but in your heart of hearts, you look at that and you go, that's immaturity, or that's defensiveness, or that's selfishness, right? Do we think that we would just get a flourishing report card back from these people? No! We wouldn't even need to wait 30 minutes. They'd be like, do you want this right now? Or take a little time to reflect on it? We have weaknesses. They're obvious to everybody else. When we allow ourselves to become obvious about them, that's step one in learning and receiving the reality that we're in with God because of our weaknesses. Not because of all this other stuff we haven't gotten right. Not whether we're on the inside or on the outside. Telling the truth about ourselves is the first step to coming to God and saying, God, I believe that these things that I'm saying out loud that I'm ashamed of, that I don't want to confess, but if I'm honest, are really some of the major sources of things that are going wrong in my life. I actually don't just believe that I'm going to confess them as trying to fix them. I'm going to confess them to you and begin to tell the truth about them in my own life because I believe that somehow me doing that and allowing those weaknesses to become real and present and known in my life is the doorway to real, free, authentic relationship with you and the truth of receiving the gospel. Once we've done that, now Christ is being formed in us. We haven't received Jesus. He's not being formed in us if we can't tell the truth about ourselves. We have to receive God's power from a place of having spoken the truth. That's what we have to do. That's when the power of Christ becomes real. That's when you learn that God actually loves you, as you are right now. Not that He wants to leave us in our immaturities, but He actually loves you as you are presently. You can't learn that until you tell the truth. And so you say, God, these are the mistakes I'm making over and over again. God, this is what salvation actually looks like for me. This is the circle I want to be on the inside of. God, these are the things that are true about me. These are my weaknesses. And when you do that, you begin to walk the road with God. You became weak. You became weak and died on the cross so that God's power might become alive in and embrace it into your life. That can happen to you. Actually a new thing. But you've got to tell the truth. And it's scary to tell the truth. And who knows where it's going to go. We let go of control when we begin to tell the truth about ourselves before God. But if God raised Jesus in your life, He's going to raise you in your life too. We know what He'll do. He's done it before. He'll do it again. Because the things that God does over and over again, they're good and holy and loving and trustworthy things. Why don't you leave behind a life where the word again is about all the things that you get wrong over and over again, and it starts to become about the things that God got right in your life over and over again? You do not need to tell the truth. Let's tell the truth about ourselves together.